restoration of the Republic, which was really the beginning of the Roman Empire. Octavian received the title of Augustus. He was also deified as a god after his death in 14 BC, same manner as Caesar. Following Octavian, Rome essentially came under the rule of dictators and emperors. For the next 350 years, Rome experienced times of prosperity as well as catastrophes and disasters. I mentioned last week as we closed out the class that from the time of the restoration of the Republic for about 200 years, it was a time of peace within the empire. They had skirmishes on the outskirts of the empire, but they were not having to fight major wars in terms of, with the goal of consolidating their own power. They were able to actually create a stable situation in the known world at the time, which allowed for the advance of Christianity, which we'll deal with next week. It was one of the factors that God used to spread the gospel with some freedom. And with Paul as a Roman citizen, he could travel all over the known world and have no problems at all going from different city to city in terms of, because there wasn't a war being fought there. So it's time of peace. You might want to make note of that as far as Pax Romana. That's something you would want to write down. AD 96 to AD 180 is a period of the 5 good emperors: Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antonius Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. Relatively stable period of leadership in the Roman Empire. And by good, I don't mean good in the sense of Christianity good. I mean good in the sense of leadership. They were good administrators. They had a stable regime in terms of their leadership. The economy, the empire was good for the most part. They did a good job administrating that. That would be the period of the 5 good emperors. The period following that was different. The century or so following these 5 emperors was marked by turmoil, war, famine, disease, disasters, and inconsistency of leadership. Between AD 235 and 284, emperors served an average of 2 years, with only 2 dying naturally and civilized at their beds. So 235 to 284, it's almost 50 years. 25 leaders in 50 years.
Sounds like some Baptist churches.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, it does. I mean, when you have leadership turnover that much, it creates significant inconsistency. The difference is the new Baptist pastor didn't assassinate the last Baptist pastor. That's what happened in the Roman Empire. A lot of these guys were assassinated by generals in the army. They were assassinated by family. They died in war. Only 2 of them died naturally. 2 of those 25. So 23 were murdered or killed in battle. We don't have chaos yet in our country, and we need to be thankful for that. I mean, so we may. Well, I mean, we can experience it. I think we've got some protections in place, and we'll look at that briefly next quarter when we look at the American Revolution and French Revolution, and then the American Constitution following that. We have some protections in place that would make it more difficult to experience the same revolutions that, say, have happened in Germany or in Russia or in other places across the world, China. It's not to say it couldn't happen here. It's just to say it would be more difficult. It might take a little longer. So who knows what's going to happen that could happen. But we certainly don't exist in the same scenario that they did in Rome. In Rome, it was top down. By this point, I mean, the emperor was not only the leader, he was deified as a god. Who's going to deny the power of a god to speak and do what he wants to do? We aren't yet at that point in our nation, and we ought to be thankful and grateful for that. In part, we're not there because we watched, historically speaking, our founders watched the the transitions between, Grecian authority in their empire and Roman authority in their empire, and then they watched the monarchies of the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries. So the founders of our country tried to come up with a constitutional republic that would create checks and balances, where you didn't have one person making all the decisions, and you didn't have a group of people who were consistently and forever in power making decisions either, but where there's a balance and there's a rotation. And in terms of how it's worked, our political system has been one of the most genius political systems. But it also works, as our founders indicated, it works based on the quality of the people in the country. If you have irreligious and irresponsible people, our form of government is not going to last very long. And that's my concern more than anything else. It's not who's in charge or who's not in charge and what's Congress doing and who the president is, although those are factors without question. My greater concern is that we have an American public who is ill-informed, uninformed, and who cares more about who won, who got kicked off on American Idol and Dancing with the Stars than they do who their representative is in the House, or who their senator is, or who their president is. That to me is of greater concern. Okay, 82, 84 to 305, you had Diocletian. He was the general who seized the throne. He believed himself a god and instituted severe persecution of Christians. He was the last Roman emperor to severely persecute the Christians until about 305. He seized their property. He kicked them out of their businesses, sold their businesses to others, or gave their businesses away to friends. At times he killed people, but this was an empire-wide persecution. Many of the persecutions that occurred for the Christian church up until about 300, not all of them, but many of them were localized. So you'd have a governor in a particular region that didn't like Christians, and so he would institute persecution in his region. There were several Roman emperors and dictators who instituted empire-wide persecution, although that was only as good as the people underneath them instituted that. So Nero did that, but much of his persecution centered in Rome itself, the city of Rome. Diocletian instituted empire-wide persecution, where Christians all across the empire were affected by either his policies or his desire to have Christians killed. Following Diocletian, you have Constantine. And Constantine was a general, and the army proclaimed him emperor in 306 AD. And then in 312, he defeated the other main general in the Roman Empire at the time, Maxentius. And he united the empire in 312. He reigned until 337. And when he faced Maxentius on the battlefield, he saw a vision. At least this is his story. This is the story that comes down to us from tradition and from history. He saw a vision in the sky the night before where the Virgin Mary had said, "Conquer in this sign." And it was the sign of the cross. And so he had his entire army paint a cross on their shields. And they went out and they defeated Maxentius. And so he took Christianity from a religion of the peasantry and slaves and took it to the emperor's throne. He built Constantinople, which is modern-day Turkey, and established what would become the Byzantine Empire. He moved the empire's capital from Rome to Constantinople, and then the Byzantine Empire would last until the 1400s. It was a pretty significant leadership window where the Roman Empire lasted. Rome itself had kind of secondary leadership and emperors for a period of time. Others tried to move it back, but it never really stuck in terms of their leadership. One question we could ask is, was Constantine genuinely a Christian? Have I got an opinion on the subject?
I have an opinion. I don't.
Share it with us, Rodney.
The faith that we believe in has always been since the Apostle John, and I just don't feel like that he did us any favors by trying to rule the world by religion. And I can't see that he was And from what I've read and understood, that he was a Christian.
Well, he did try to lead the world he did try to, he didn't dictate you become a Christian, but he legalized Christianity. So for those that were underneath his authority, as Christians, it was really good. They got their businesses back, they got their homes back, they got their property back. He legalized Christianity as a religion among the religions of the empire, which was a good thing. I think to a certain degree, he had some kind of Christian influence. Whether we're going to meet him in heaven, that's between him and God. I don't know. But I think there was some kind of influence that he had.
I've read some writings that say that his form of Christianity was promoted. But that, like a lot of the things that we believe, that even Protestants protested against, those people were still persecuted even through this time.
Not in particular under Constantine. He didn't persecute Christians, but I will say this. The version of Christianity that he held to would not be something you and I are comfortable with today. But part of the reason for that is Christianity had not had a chance to establish itself theologically or in terms of ecclesiology. I mean, the first 300 years of church history, the church is trying to survive. The most important things to the church up until Constantine were survival and evangelism. And so the things that you and I talk about today, theology and church history and church government structure and all those types of things, yes, and all those types of things, they were non-existent or relatively non-existent for the first 300 years of church history because the church as a whole is trying to survive and then share the gospel. In fact, when you see churches that are persecuted, that's what they do. The church in China is growing because they're being persecuted. They're growing because they focus on survival, try to keep things secret so that they can actually worship. But then when they get an opportunity, they share the gospel. Their theology, in terms of grounded theology, is not the most important thing. That's not to say it's not important. I'm just saying in that context of persecution, it's not that important. So certainly we would probably not be comfortable with Constantine stepping into our church today and being a deacon in the church. But we've got to consider the reasons for that. They hadn't developed some theological framework at this point. He did call some of the early councils that dealt with church theology, the Council of Nicaea, in particular in AD 325, where they dealt with the issue of Christology. Was Christ God? And you'll talk about that actually in my brother's class when you get there in the person and ministry of Christ. Talk about the Council of Nicaea. Constantine called for that. Yes?
Dr. Pavlak on page 97, he actually said his opinion was that Constantine himself probably remained a pagan until his death.
Well, and part of the reason for that is he still allowed pagan worship to go on. He didn't criminalize paganism, and he didn't take Christianity and make it the primary religion in the empire. That would happen under Theodosius in 335, that's in my notes here, where paganism was actually outlawed later in the empire, which did much more damage to Christianity than its legalization. Christianity's legalization simply gave it some rights, gave Christians some opportunity to live. When they criminalized paganism under Theodosius and said Christianity is going to be the religion of the Roman Empire, well, what did that do? That watered down and neutralized Christianity's influence, because then a lot of pagans became Christians just so they could survive and have business. Because morality wasn't really a concern for them. They didn't care. I mean, they just wanted a business. And so that did more damage to Christianity, actually, than what Constantine had done. But he was baptized literally on his deathbed. Of course, baptism for the early church was different than the way you and I would understand baptism as believers' baptism. We're baptized in obedience as a symbol of the saving faith that's already taken place. Baptism in that day and age would have carried with it, at least in many of their minds, some kind of salvific effect. And so you get that from the Catholic Church as well. But Constantine was baptized on his deathbed. I have no doubt he had some kind of experience. I don't know that I even question the vision where he saw in this sign conquering. I don't know that it came from God. I mean, I'm not trying to say that, but I think something happened experientially for him that gave him the opportunity to legalize Christianity.
We know that God used him, that's for sure.
Yeah, In some good ways, and of course, I mean, we could debate some of the bad ways too, but I don't think you're going to debate any, I mean, if you talk to any of the Christians that got their businesses and their homes and their property back, they're not going to say Constantine was a bad guy. Does that make sense?
Was he sprinkled when he was on his deathbed?
I think it was immersed. If I remember the painting correctly, I think it was immersion. Sprinkling wouldn't really. It might have been. It might have been. But I think it was immersion. Theodosius 380. He forbids the worship of pagan gods. That did more damage to Christianity than Constantine. Okay, 410, the sack of Rome by the Visigoths, which is the cause for Augustine's The City of God, which is an apologetic text, by the way, a work where Augustine made a claim that Christianity wasn't the reason that Rome fell, but that its paganism, wickedness, and ill leadership for hundreds of years was the reason that Rome fell. Because what happened is Christianity came to power 100 years before, and then Rome got sacked. And so many of the people in Rome were then looked and said, we're going to blame Christianity. We think Christians are the reasons for this. And Augustine made the case that wasn't, in the City of God, that wasn't the case. 455, the Vandals sacked Rome. 476, the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustus, was deposed. And then finally, in 1453, Constantinople fell to the Ottomans, thus ending the Byzantine Empire. So let's get a couple of dates here. If you'll write this slide, all these dates down. 509 and 27 BC would be the era of the Republic in the Roman Empire. 27 BC to 312 AD is the era of the emperors centered in Rome, where Rome was the capital of the empire underneath its emperors. And then 312 AD to 1453 AD is the Byzantine Empire, where the center of leadership in the empire was in Constantinople.
Dr. Hefner, I've got a question. Julius Caesar, did he serve under the era of the Republic?
Technically, yes. Caesar would have been, I mentioned this but very, very briefly last week, he would have been the first dictator. Not technically an emperor. And he was one of the select generals from the Senate. The Senate had selected him to be a general. He led the armies. And what Caesar did is something happened. I don't remember the whole story, but something happened he didn't like, so he marched his army into Rome.
Right.
And when he did, that's kind of like, you march an army into a city, that's showing off. That's saying you have the power and authority. And essentially he established himself as what we would consider a dictator. He dictated then to the Senate and to the rest of those underneath his authority what would happen. He didn't last very long. He only existed in that role about 5 years. Of course, right. He was killed by his friend, right. Assassinated by Brutus. And then after that, there was some instability and indecision, not sure what would happen. That was about 49 BC or so. And then from about 44 BC until which was when he died, until about 27, there was still a republic, but it was kind of shredded because Caesar and others had re-envisioned the Constitution underneath their own desires and underneath their own vision of what should happen within the Roman Empire and that sort of thing. So there was instability until Augustus came along in 27, and he termed it the restoration of the Republic, which is, we ought to be cautious of politicians when they use flowery language, because oftentimes what they say and what they mean are two completely different things. And when Augustus said, we're going to restore the Republic, he wasn't meaning we're going to give power back to the Senate and give power back to the representation of the people. He meant we're going to establish power in Rome and I'm the emperor. And that's what happened in 27. Okay, let's buzz through. What time is it? Yeah, we're fine. Okay, so some governmental strategy. If you want to see how the Roman Empire worked itself out, you can note Pavlik's diagram on page 82. I mentioned that last week, but it breaks down this essential time frame and what the government or what the empire looked like underneath emperor and dictator authorities. we won't look good. One thing you did have, and I did briefly mention this last week, you had an annual election of consuls during the Republic era. Now, I mentioned last week how a consul essentially was above the law, but the reason that was kind of hampered in terms of them trying to become a dictator was that somebody else who wasn't your friend might be elected consul the next year. So anything you did, they might take revenge on you for that. When Marius was elected in 112, that began to reshape the concept of the annual leadership. It's like, even in our government, it's not a terrible thing that we have a Democrat in office and then a Republican in office. What that does is it creates a balance of power. The government moves one way and the government moves back another way. There tends to be like a swing one way or the other. That's not a terrible thing for our nation, and for our nation in terms of long-term leadership. The challenge is when that power is consolidated in one way or the other. If we had 45 years of Republican leadership or 45 years of Democratic leadership, our country would look far different after that period of time. But it's, when you start having one leader and one authority and one idea and one political strategy, then that's when things start to get problematic. One thing I mentioned last week as well, and I didn't explain this, so I'm going to do that today. The patricians, they were the elite class who served in the Senate and in the leadership roles. Anybody familiar with the movie The Godfather? Okay. That mentality was born in Italy, in Rome's Italy. The idea that the Godfather, who is wealthy, he's going to take care of everybody underneath him, but then he's going to expect a lot of those who work underneath him. One of the things that Rome consistently was able to do during its military advance was raise an army. I noted last week how Hannibal wiped out 90,000 Roman troops, or 70,000 Roman troops in one battle. And yet Rome was able to raise another army and go out and eventually defeat Hannibal in Carthage and continue to advance. One of the ways Rome was able to do that, one reason was they were a militaristic worldview. They believed that it was their destiny to conquer. And so that was kind of inborn into the entire peninsula, Italian peninsula, in particular Rome. Another way, though, that they were able to raise an army is this element of control by patricians. So, for example, Stephen, we're going to make you a patrician. You serve in the Senate, Rome Senate. All right? And Will and Nicholas and China, you guys are serfs. You live on his property, you work his land, and you don't necessarily dislike that because Stephen's a good guy. He kind of helps you out. He's a good landowner. He gives you, you have to work for him, but he gives you back what you earn and that sort of thing. But one thing Stephen does as a senator, you don't get a vote for the Senate, but you do get to vote in other areas as free citizens. Stephen will come to you occasionally, Nicholas, and he'll tell you who you need to vote for. And what are you going to do?
Vote for that person.
Vote for that person. That's exactly right. And then your sons get to be of military age. And he says, I want you to send your sons off to join Augustus Caesar in the army. And you say, well, I need my sons here to help work the land. He says, no, I need you to send your son to go to the military. And you say, no, I need to send my son, I need my son to stay and work the land. He says, okay, that's no big deal. But then in a couple of months, your daughter gets sick. Of course, you'd be a serf, you don't have any money. And so what do? You go to the only person you know to go to. You go to Stephen, and you say, Stephen, can you help me get some medicine for my daughter? You know what he's going to say? You didn't send your son to serve in the army like I asked you to. What are you going to do the next time somebody gets sick? Or what are you going to do the next time Stephen asks you to send your son to the army?
Do it.
Yes. So there was this element of control by the patricians where they would care for the people underneath them. And they were good. In that sense, it's like the Godfather. I mean, the Godfather was good to everybody who worked underneath him. You didn't cross the Godfather. He protected you, right? Marlon Brando putting his hand on the guy's shoulder and saying, he protected them. But if you crossed them, you were in bad shape. And that kind of mentality, that kind of concept developed in this era, and it was also one of the ways that they were able to raise an army, because they had influence, greater influence than even their land gave them, because they had influence over the people underneath their land and sending their sons off to war. The plebeians were the working class. That would have been you, Nicholas, and Will, and China. You guys would have been plebeians in that illustration I just used. They were allowed citizenship and votes, but were controlled by the godfather patricians, which helped establish power for you, Stephen, and for those that would have been patricians in that era. There was empire-wide citizenship, which gave people an ownership in the events of the day, politically. A practical example is Cicero. He was a lawyer, 106 to 43. He said, "True law is right reason and agreement with nature." A couple other things he said that were interesting. He said this: "The best constitution for a state is to be that which is a balanced combination of the three forms mentioned: kingship, aristocracy, and democracy, and does not irritate by punishment a rude and savage heart." And the Roman Empire had a little bit of that. They had the consuls, who essentially operated as the executive branch or kings. They had the aristocracy, which would have been the Senate, because only those who were patricians could have served in the Senate, wealthy landowners. And then they had democracy, where everybody could vote either for other roles and responsibilities in government. But they certainly had an influence, or a little bit of an influence. And so that's the form of government Cicero argued for, which would essentially be the form of government that our founding fathers put together, something in that vein anyway. A devolution into dictatorship. The wars of aggression in Italy, civil wars, and growing divide between the rich and the poor, corruption, etc., created a social situation in Rome where popularity and stability was desired. These circumstances, among other things, allowed for men like Marius, Caesar, and Octavian to thwart the Constitution. As one constitutional barrier fell and then another, it became easier for Rome to be ruled by a dictator. And by the way, that is a lesson for us to learn from here in our America. When we devalue the Constitution, whether that's President Bush or whether that's President Obama or whether that's the next president that's going to come into office, when we devalue the Constitution, it's not always the person who does it that's we're going to see the problem with that. It's what it leads to. It's the precedent that is set. And that's the biggest issue with it. In Rome's history, it wasn't Marius that led into an empire, or Caesar, but it wouldn't have happened if they hadn't done that. And so once the Constitution meant little or nothing, then eventually what that led to is a dictatorship or an emperorship, as we see in Rome. Some benefits to Rome in the ancient world, and you might want to write a couple of these down in terms of military advancements. Rome had an uncanny ability to raise armies quickly. I mentioned a little bit as to how that was the case. They had an impassioned and relentless desire to win. After losing multiple armies, they would raise yet another in order to finally win. 60-man legions were able to fight in any terrain. They advanced at the right time. Timing was important for the Roman Empire. The divided Greek Empire under Alexander had significantly weakened through infighting. So when Rome advanced east, she had conflict, but nothing that repelled her, offering citizenship and law, where she ruled brought stability. For example, Pontius Pilate was a governor, of course, in Jerusalem at the time of Christ. And so that type of leadership created stability across the empire.
How long would it take them to raise up an army? About
Months,
months.
if that. And they also had multiple armies, multiple standing armies. So they would have had a couple of generals who had a particular army who would have been fighting in different places. So sometimes that would mean they would transfer a general to a new place. Other times it would mean that another general would raise another army.
Oh, okay.
So weeks, months, but not often very long. But if you're talking about Carthage, let's say they had 60,000 men, fighting men. Rome lost 60,000 in one battle. But if they lost, let's say if Carthage lost 15,000 men, but that's all, then they had 45, and Rome every 6 years could raise an army of 50,000 men, just by attrition they're going to win. They're going to overwhelm the other forces, and that's really what they did. Technological advancements. Roman architecture stood for centuries as the standard for European culture. In fact, the legions were required to dig in every night. So if they were on military advance and they stopped for the night, they were required to dig in, build ramparts, and make a defensible camp every time they moved somewhere. Kind of tough, isn't it? But what do you think that does to you after you come out of the military? You know how to engineer, you know how to survey, you know how to build. And so it created a level of competency among the Roman citizenry that wouldn't have happened otherwise with their legions and their military men. Also, the Roman roads were constructed to allow for easy travel by the legions. They also promoted commerce in the ancient world. I mean, the goal of the Roman roads was to move armies. But secondarily, commerce happened and trade happened, and ironically or interestingly enough, some of those roads are still used today. Not just in existence, some people still actually walk on them and use them for commerce. 2,000 years later. Isn't that amazing? This road, I promise you, Fruitland Road is not going to last 2,000 years from now.
You think?
That asphalt is not, it does not stand up that well. Yes, sir.
My brother is an architect, and 2 years ago he had the opportunity to go to Italy, burning up some frequent flyer miles, and when he came back, I asked him, I said, what was the best thing you saw in Italy? And he said, the concrete. And I said, what? He said, the concrete. He said, theirs lasts 1,000 years. We can't make some that'll last 100.
That's right. I mean, it's amazing the quality and the technological advance they had 2,000 years ago. And, some of those Roman roads were the ways by which evangelists traveled, shared the gospel. So you might want to note that for a test question, that Roman roads played a part in the advance of the early church. We'll deal with that specifically next week when we look at the rise of Christianity, but make note of that today. Cruelty and entertainment. The Colosseum of Rome staged gladiatorial fights, reenactments, and executions. It's the major symbol of the many places throughout Rome where such entertainment was popular. The Colosseum is not the only place that martyrdoms happened and gladiatorial fights happened, but it is the symbol of that. And by the way, I certainly think that we have experienced and are experiencing degradation and wickedness in our culture. There's no doubt about that. But I don't think our culture is any worse than cultures that have existed previously or before us. Okay? I think if there's a factor that makes our culture, terribly wicked, it's the fact that it is so easily accessible. I mean, if you wanted to be degraded in Rome, you had to go find somebody to be degraded with, literally, personally, find somebody. Today, I mean, we've got with the advent of the internet and smartphones, I mean, everybody has access to wickedness and something terrible immediately in front of them. But if you want to make a case that our society has not reached the society of Rome, you just look at the gladiatorial arenas. I mean, we may watch violence on television as entertainment, but that's what it is. It's entertainment. It's not real. It's fiction. They actually did it. I mean, you think some of the horrible movies that are out, or that have come out recently. I mean, the Purge and the Saw movies. That all they are is gruesome and gore. And I've not seen them, and I don't plan to. But people watch that to be entertained by that. You think, man, how's that? Well, in Rome, they were sitting in the arena cheering on a gladiator who was killing someone else. Not in fake, not on a screen, not by actors, not done by CGI and computers, but actual blood, actual death. They were sitting there in that arena cheering on the events that they were watching. That's a degraded, wicked culture. Far different than what we experience and have experienced. Just keep that in mind, okay? Sure, we have a wicked culture, but I get sometimes a little bit, how do I say? I get a little bummed out by some pastors and preachers who want to talk about 21st century America being the worst and most evil culture that's ever existed on the face of the planet. And kind of doomsdayers. Yeah, we're bad, we're sinful, and we're wicked, and we're evil, but we're no more wicked and evil and sinful than the cultures in the previous eras that have existed before. We have a tendency to look at ours because we're living in it and see it as the worst. The reality is every culture that's ever been, every time frame, every group of people, every empire, every republic, every nation, every country needs Jesus equally as much. Many slaves and Christians would die for the pure entertainment of Rome. Put Christians in an arena and let animals kill them just to see what would happen. And call that entertainment. It's despicable. The Roman world was not a golden age of human ingenuity, but rather a picture of human debasement. They offered stability and citizenship, but they did so through intimidation, lust for power, and incipient cruelty. That's the Roman Empire. Rome kept her stranglehold on the ancient world through these means, and she also displayed a natural degeneracy that's in human nature, and in this way is a precursor for modern Western civilization. I mean, their debasement, I mean, why do we watch entertainment that has blood in it and people dying? Well, we're following after our forefathers. Even though it's not actual murder, in most cases, it is a picture of, well, we get that from them. Religion and culture. Religion in the Roman world was intensely pluralistic. Rome adopted and renamed the gods of the Greek pantheon, and the empire allowed the general population the freedom to worship many other gods. When adding emperor worship to this religious pluralism, Rome became a very religious empire. It is in this religious context that Christianity came into existence, and that's what we're going to deal with next week. What do I mean by a pluralistic culture? I mean that in ancient Rome, there were multiple religious expressions, multiple faiths, and multiple ways that you could interact with God, or gods, or the God, the system of gods, the pantheon of gods. The one that was not given opportunity to exist in that culture was Christianity. In fact, some of the earliest Christians defended Christianity against the charge of, guess what? Atheism.
Wow.
You know why?
Because they didn't believe in all the other gods.
That's exactly right. They were charged as atheists because for them there was only one God, and all of the other gods were not real gods. And we're going to talk about the rise of Christianity in that religious culture next week. Any questions or comments? Today's week 6. By week 8, you need to have your forum post online, so make sure you go ahead and do that. Week 9, you turn in the balance of your summaries. And, of course, week 10, we will have a final